or it's kind of interesting that when I started on the research a couple months ago for the next generation renderer, I sat down to just start testing these things, building some of the interfaces or building some of the actual rendering test features. And it was interesting to see that in this kind of experimental mode, I did just fall immediately back to functional C programming for things. I wound up making a class to encapsulate the awful render buffer or pbuffer and render texture interfaces. But when I'm just hacking around on graphics, it still winds up being more natural to use a functional programming interface. And I'm a little curious if that's just me or if that just winds up being the way graphics tends to be done on there. When you start building an actual engine that's going to be interfacing with a lot of different things, then the kind of interface rigor of a good object-oriented interface is beyond question valuable on there. But the internals are still a little bit C-ish on there, even on the brand new stuff. So a lot of the issues with rendering engine design are in these things that aren't actually involved with drawing pictures, because everybody draws things the same way now. No matter what you're drawing, it winds up being binding a fragment program, a vertex program, setting some parameters, binding some textures, and then drawing a bunch of triangles. That's the same at the core of absolutely everything that everybody's doing now if you're using 3D hardware. So in theory, all engines can draw all media from all other engines, because at the bottom line there, they're all doing the same thing. All the kind of innovation and kind of important decisions get made in how you determine exactly what the geometry is going to be, what the textures are going to be, and what the programs are going to be. And that's one of the things that I've always been down on is when people do shader previewers and things like that, and shader integration into into tools like 3D Studio and Maya. Those are really not very useful things, because yes, it lets you take this bottom line thing of throw a program and throw some geometry at it, but all of the interesting things that happen in the game engine come from things like interactions and parameter passing, and how the game world is determining the parameters that are used for the rendering, how the rendering engine composites together either different layers of effects or different parts of programs. So you're not going to have that many things that are just here's a fragment program. You'll get that for special effects, all the artifact effects where we've got the heat haze thing that I threw in late in the game and got used all over the game just because people liked that that type of little thing. So there's special effects like that you will get some use from that are just here's the fragment program that does the special effect. But so much of the stuff is going to be dynamic composition of the different programs, where if you've got if you've got opacity mapping, where you have to determine which areas are actually going to be drawn on, combined with arbitrary interaction programming, combined with different shadowing programs, combined with deformations of the top-level surfaces, there's undoubtedly going to be this kind of dynamic combining of different programs in there. And that's one of those things that I'm not completely clear yet what the right solution is going to be. So whenever I'm in those cases, I usually implement a couple different paths and just see what works out best. Because there are many different directions that you could possibly take. One of the easiest ones that will probably get tried first is basically adding sort of macro capability to the fragment programs, where you could say light calculation here, stick it in register R0, and that might do light combination by two projected textures, or it could wind up doing an actual distance-based calculation or use a 3D light. There's a number of different things that you might want to have for kind of light shaders on here that can be combined with arbitrary surface shaders. And you get similar things like that where you want to be able to toss on a deformation onto an arbitrary an arbitrary surface rendering. You want to be able to say, I want to put the grass blowing in the wind deform on these multiple different things that, we've got sticks and grass and these different things in here that could be used in a static surface, but you also want to be able to have them deformed. And that's, that gets also more complicated if you wind up having, say, different tangent space calculations on there, where there are some potential advantages to using global maps instead of local maps, even for deformed things where you're deforming full axes rather than moving just the vertexes around. And if you have that type of thing, the sense of what is a normal map may be different. We also have some things like height maps may be included in the game, even though they're They're very inferior to normal maps for surface characteristics, but height maps can be used for for other things, like if we eventually do have a displacement surface, displacement mapping option in the game, you would need a height map rather than a normal map on there. There's some cheap hack things, like I put in a trial of displacement, not actual displacement, but surface warping based on the height maps to try and kind of fake displacement mapping. That didn't work out well enough, where you can make a few textures where it looks really cool and awesome, but if you try using it on things in general, you get too many places that are kind of sheared and warped and not looking very good on there. But that's an example of something that's an easy effect to have in, and we can use it for some special effect surfaces and interesting things like that, but it's not a generally utilizable function. But height maps will also be needed if we do things like bump map occlusion, so you get kind of self-shadowing amongst the bumps in the different areas, although again that'll be at the cost of an additional texture and more problems on there. I have some interesting thoughts for being able to do sort of a screen space displacement mapping where we render different offsets into the screen and then go back and re-render the screen, warping the entire things as necessary for that, which would solve the T-junction cracking problem that you get when using real displacement mapping across surfaces where the edges don't necessarily line up. There's a lot of other interesting things that that we can be doing there. I expect that I will probably have. We're going to be starting media creation using the new technologies pretty soon. Over the next month or so, I expect the artists will start working on some of the things utilizing some of the new features, like the specularity maps and building scenes with the soft shadows and so on like that. But I am kind of waiting on some help with the hardware vendors to get the shadow buffering up to the full performance that we're going to need to have that as a replacement. But I would expect that by the end of this year, we'll probably be rendering some demo scenes that will be indicative of what the technology is eventually going to be producing. But the render will probably take another year to mature to its full kind of final form as far as interfaces, what the programming APIs are going to be, and exactly how the media for programming it is going to be used. But I do expect in the end that the flexibility that you're going to have, you're probably going to be programming things at surface interaction level, light level, deformations, opacity level, where if necessary you can stick in full programs to do really exactly what you want there. We're going to have nearly the capability of a traditional scanline offline renderer, and if you want to take the game and crank the values way up, you can use, of course, textures as big as you want. You'll have lots of places where you can turn the sampling levels up a lot higher. You can change if you want your high dynamic range light blooms to be, really, really accurate on there. You could say instead of downsampling 3 times, do them on the native, the native frame buffer level, and instead of using a separable Gaussian filter, go ahead and, use this real 100 by 100 actual filter on there if you really, really wanted to have perfect starburst lines coming off of things. And there will be these areas where just changing the data will let you crank up the performance or the quality at the expense of performance to things that are, really honestly film quality rendering. I mean, that term gets thrown around constantly, like since the advent of hardware accelerated renderings, and lots of people mention things like that for Doom, but we're still living in a notchy feature set on the renderer, and there's still immense amounts of things that the game engines don't do that you need for offline rendering. But with the next engine, you're not going to have the capability of doing every last little thing you would do with an offline renderer, but you will be able to produce scenes that are effectively indistinguishable from a typical offline scanline render if you throw the appropriate data at it and avoid a couple of the things that it's just not going to do as well. And that's going to be interesting. We're seeing graphics accelerated hardware now, especially with the multi-chip, multi-board options that are going to be coming out, where you're going to be able to have a single system, your typical beige box multi-PCI Express system stuffed with video cards cross-connected together, and you're going to have, with a game engine like this and hardware like that, the rendering capability of a major studio like Pixar's entire render farm, and it's going to be sitting in a box and probably cost $10,000. And not only does it have the throughput of a rendering farm, where you're looking at in terms of total frames possible rendered in a given amount of time. The important thing is it's going to have a fraction of the latency of it, where if it takes 30 minutes to render a film quality frame, you can throw 1,000 systems at it and render a whole bunch of frames, but it still takes 30 minutes to get your main frame back. If you can kill the latency down like that, where you're actually rendering it in 1,000th of 30 minutes on there, that's a far, far better thing from a creative standpoint on there. And I think there's going to be some interesting stuff going on. Already there are studios working with hardware accelerated renderers they're coming at it from a different angle there, where they're coming at it from how can we take a real offline render and start using GPU technology to accelerate some of it, while we're coming from the side of how do we make a game that's already designed to use all of this very efficiently begin to have all of the features that the offline renderers have. And there will be some interesting overlaps between the two different approaches. But a few years from now, you're going to see it's going to start seeming like an anachronism when a few studios decide to absolutely stick to their guns on the huge offline rendering things. It'll still be the case for multi-$100 million film studios where they absolutely positively must get, say, certain reflections exactly the way they want, certain filtering exactly the way they want. But everybody that's cost conscious is going to be moving towards this type of GPU accelerated real-time rendering. We'll probably see it first in TV shows, but it will not be long until film quality rendering is at least using GPU acceleration of classical style renderers, and perhaps in some cases using effectively game rendering engines. Now, there's an interesting thing to note about engine technology in general. We've got a good example here. Doom has probably gotten more universal praise for the quality of the audio than it has for the graphics. Now, there's some lessons to be learned from this. I took over the audio engine work this last year after Graham left, and we made some really large changes in exactly what Doom was doing for audio. When we started off, we knew that we had a lot more CPU power and we could afford to do some sophisticated things with audio. So the original Doom audio engine had head modeling, room modeling, all of the typical DSP high-end stuff that you think about doing for virtual environments and simulations. And it sort of worked, but we had these option flags where you could say plain sound on here, where when the sound designers didn't like the way things were sounding because the engine was mucking with all the sounds, you would just set it to plain. And we were using this in an awful lot of places on there. And when I took over the sound code, I basically redid everything so it had none of those features, and all it does is one-to-one mix the audio data that the sound designers have actually created, and it does some mildly interesting stuff for localizing the sounds through portals. But basically, it's a really, really simple engine. It's not much code. The code is less than half the code that it was when I took over the code base there. And the most important thing is it's nice and robust now, and it does predictably exactly what the sound designers want it to do. So this is a case of, it looks like we've got phenomenal sound on all this, but it's a very straightforward, basic thing that it's exposing a good canvas for the designers to work on, where they know what the sounds sound like. They want them to be like this, maybe just quieter, depending on as you're going around. We've got the ability to have them, play non-localized stereo sounds, play sounds that cut off a few different basic features that you've got, like do you want it to be occluded, do you want it to do portal chaining through there. But basically, all it's doing is taking the sounds, multiplying them by whatever the current attenuation factor is, and adding them together. And this is something that there's always a danger of running into kind of the sophistry of excessive complexity and sophistication in an engine, and I think we ran past that with sound, recovered, and produced exactly what we needed to on there. But that's also always a worry with graphics technologies, where you can do really, really sophisticated things that might be very correct on graphics, especially with light transport. We know exactly how light works. We can simulate light very, very precisely. If we want to spend the time, we can do photon tracing and radiosity and all of these things. But in many cases, it just turns out that not only is that perhaps not necessary, but in many cases, it's just not even what you want to do from a game design standpoint. For instance, right here, while I'm being videoed, there are a number of lights set up to provide a better view of what's going to actually be captured onto the video rather than the natural lighting of the room that I'm in. And in offline renderers, people they're constantly setting up lights that don't behave exactly like real lights or ignore surfaces, don't make shadows, lights that only cast onto certain things. And I've always thought that the important things are to provide tools that behave the way the designers expect them to. So if you give a craftsman, you've got talented people creating the media, if you give them tools that they understand that work the way they want them to, and hopefully work with a short latency and that allow them rapid turnaround and good incremental viewing of what they're working on, that's the most positive thing that you can do in a game engine. And Doom made several really significant advances for that in terms of media creation. Obviously, the level editor, being able to have the dynamically update the lights and shadows directly while you're making things was a really big advance. Having everything set up for fast, rapid media reload, was a big deal. Getting away from the complex offline processing that we had in the Quake series of games, changed it from a 30-minute relight or reviz time to just immediately moving a light or changing its color and seeing it right then and there. We've got a number of things that we're expecting to improve in the next generation for tightening the integration between game editing and level editing. That was one thing where, for a long time, I was a proponent of separate tools, and I still think that I had plenty good reasons at the time that we did these things. While some people had integrated level editors into early games, and we were using separate programs because we used separate hardware at the time for that. We had really high-end workstations that we could run everything on, while some people were editing their games basically on the target consumer platforms. But now that those specs have basically merged, Doom did the right thing and integrated the level editor. But there's a lot more things that we can take advantage of with that integration that we haven't yet. Things like being able to be playing the game and dynamically changing some things. We have Sound Editor integrated with the game, where the audio designers can run around and modify sounds literally while they're playing the game. It's obvious that we should have light editing the same way. And then there's a few things that will follow that same route, but will take a little bit more programming design effort to set up. Like, we should be able to, reset object positions while you're playing the game. You should be able to always knock it back to kind of their spawn position, adjust things around, and conditionally restart the level in different places. And that's a lot of the design work that we're going to be going over on the high architectural level between things. But the overriding concern for us is that we don't want the next game to take as long to make as Doom did. So we're going to be pretty rational about how grand we're going to be making these changes. I'm confident the render will take less than a year to make, which gives us plenty of time to go ahead and get full skill base and utilization, and have time to polish everything with that. But most of the other changes throughout the system, we're going to try and have things set up so that we don't force the level designers to work with really broken stuff for a year or more before they can actually really start working on things. We're all pretty excited about where we're going with the next title, and we're not saying much about it yet. But I think it's actually a pretty good plan when you're pushing new technology, like the new Doom engine, to have the first version come out be the single-player experience where people are expecting it to run a little bit slower, and you can tolerate all that in those conditions. And then when expansions and sequels and things like that come out that use the same technology, with another year or two of hardware progress, all of a sudden what was a borderline experience speed-wise on one system becomes, again, 60 frames per second running locked on the later hardware, and that's a better environment for multiplayer, because the multiplayer systems, really, we're over the knee of the curve in terms of the benefit that you get from adding cool new graphics to multiplayer systems. Obviously, some of the very popular multiplayer games really don't have that good of graphics, and they're really popular because they're fun. Now, we can make fun games. We certainly think that we do good game design on all of our current stuff. But if id Software wants to play to our strengths as a company, where we've got all this great technology and media in addition to game design and gameplay work on here, we're going to be producing another game that has a strong immersive single-player experience with a minimalist multiplayer, again, about the level of Doom, where it's there, it's a basis. If people want to expand upon it, they're free to, and then we'll have partner companies probably work on taking it to the real super high level of polish that's kind of demanded for a multiplayer-oriented game nowadays. I thought about actually showing little snippets and scenes from the new technologies that I'm working on here, but we decided that programmer demos just don't put our best foot forward, and I'd hate to have some blurry shot that somebody took from here posted up on all the websites as id Software's brand new technology that shows my box room with one character in it and some smudge that's supposed to be really cool on there. Next year, once the artists and level designers have had an opportunity to actually build real media that exploits the new capabilities, we'll be showing some really cool stuff.